Awesome. Welcome, everyone. My name's Lani Roy. I'm the founder and director of the Science of Life Psychology. And I'm just really excited to be here with Dr. Jamie Rickord from Ananda Clinics. We've been working together for a couple of years now, a lot of different clients and different presentations, the incredible CBD and THC. And he's going to take us through a really detailed presentation tonight, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. And yeah, I guess I just wanted to, before we begin, just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we're from. So if you'd like to close your eyes for a moment, we can shake off the day and really arrive here together in this space together. And just being really grateful for Australia and First Nations people, if anyone is here today, just honouring contribution, past, present, and yet to come. Incredible artwork, the dreaming, the lessons of living deeply in symbiosis with the natural world, plant kingdom, animals. And tonight, I just invite you to really be open-minded to the molecules of CBD and THC, but potentially even the plant spirit that many people connect to when they use this medicine intentionally, with purpose, and to treat a whole range of mental health conditions and physical difficulties. Again, just really putting out that prayer and that intention for the Australian psychedelic community as it grows and evolves, that we do so with integrity. We learn quickly from our mistakes, and we have real reverence for these medicines, and that our practices and how we treat each other reflect that. Thank you. Just before we get to Jamie, just wanted to introduce the Science of Life Psychology briefly. So my practice has been around for a long time, and it's grown as I have grown, and it will continue to. And just a shout out to the partners that we are connected to, which is PRISM, Psychedelic Research and Science, the Australian Psychedelic Society, and EGA, and Entheogenesis Australis, who's having a conference at the end of the year in November, which I encourage you to check out. And also the Mental Health Foundation Australia, who does incredible work, particularly from a multicultural perspective. And at the Science of Life, we offer a range of programs, so study groups, psychedelic integration groups, webinars. Me and Melissa run a range of programs specialising in psychedelic integration and preparation, and also post-traumatic growth after sexual abuse and psychedelics. So really working in that space of healing and bridging the science and the sacred, particularly for people who've had complex trauma, PTSD. And yeah, really excited to be here and see you all and see familiar faces. And over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Alana. It's very nice to be here, and I really liked a lot of the comments you just made, actually. So I hope that we can kind of add some more to that tonight. I'm going to talk for a little while about everything Alana mentioned, but also the endocannabinoid system, really, and sort of how I've begun to conceptualize its physiology, and then how so I've got a bit of a urty from my son, so if I'm sniffing tonight, that's sorry about that. Yeah, so really about how this system works, and then how we take molecules from a plant to manipulate that system, and how really it's got very little to do with how we've previously maybe used cannabis, so recreationally, or you know, smoking bongs or all that kind of stuff. It's got virtually nothing to do with the medicine. And I think that applies to all of these new treatments that we're trying to get through that are at the moment all victims of the war on drugs, because really it's just molecules at receptors in the brain, and then that induces changes in physiology, which we can then understand to help people treat physical or emotional pain or mental health problems. So yeah, that's kind of, I'll talk a bit more about that, but initially I'll just talk about this amazing plant. So there's a picture here of some medicine, which I think is the first important point to make, because some people will see a bud, other people will see something they had in Amsterdam, some people will want to put it in a bong, but I see medicine there. I don't see anything else anymore. Maybe in the past I used to think like that too, so I understand it, but I don't think like that anymore. Now this first slide is probably slightly incorrect, because it says treatment is not about curing the condition. That's actually not true, but what that's referring to is that in Australia currently there isn't evidence to support cannabis treatments to cure conditions. There's evidence to use it to alleviate difficult symptoms with mild side effects, which might then improve people's quality of life. So that's very important. But it does lead to cure, not for everything. You know, some people with epilepsy will always have epilepsy, but I think for mental health and for trauma especially, it can lead to cure. And if you read a lot of research that's being done at the moment or recently done around the endocannabinoid system, and PTSD, complex PTSD, what's becoming quite clear is that is what we would call a hypoendocannabinoid state. So trauma results in the depletion of endocannabinoids. Now, that makes total sense why so many people with trauma self-medicate with cannabinoids, because they have an hypocannabinoid state in their body. So they take from the plant and they put it in their body and they feel better. It can be used to treat depression, anxiety, pain, all sorts of things, really. And up until very recently, we, especially as a medical system, would tell them that they were doing something wrong and that they were doing something illegal, and we'd frown at it, or doctors would frown at it and tell them off. So you've got people with trauma who are going to get some help from someone who are then being told off for doing the only thing that works for them, which does create a bit of a paradox in my mind. So that's one of the great things about being able to give people these treatments now, without that stigma. And that, I think, is very applicable to cannabis and psychedelics, and these old methods of treating people that we're trying to get back into modern medicine in place of stuff that doesn't work, that was invented by humans instead of invented by nature. So we've used cannabis for a really long time. And I put these slides in this talk because I think it's really interesting what some of these bottles say. So it's made from cannabis sativa or American hemp. And this one, the red one, says indications: great nervous depression, genitourinary irritasm, neuralgia, improve appetite, cause a feeling of general contentment. So that was written on a bottle over 100 years ago. And that's exactly what we prescribe it for today. And it's that last bit, a feeling of general contentment, that I think is the most important bit, because that's what it does. Now, you can overdose it, you can underdose it, but it generally makes people feel a lot better. So the question is why? How is it having that effect? What is it doing within the human body that means people feel generally more content? And that is about homeostasis, which is really where this talk is going. So it was liberally, everyone had a bottle of cannabis medicine in their cupboard up until about 60 years ago, 70 years ago, and then it got banned. We're not going to go into why it got banned, and we're not going to go into why it hasn't been unbanned. But it hasn't been unbanned because of the $350 million that the current research evidence-based paradigm requires of company to spend to get the evidence that's needed to register it as a drug. And when they brought that rule in, which was after thalidomide was when it became really pushed for the benefit of society that these drugs must go through the appropriate trials, which was a good thing. It was to protect us, protect society. But the problem is it doesn't apply to non-patentable compounds, because for that 350 million US, the company gets a 10-year patent in which they can make 1,000 million US. So they get their money back, so they're prepared to spend it. And that's the treatment, the problem we're facing with these new treatments. So what changed? The war on drugs changed it all. Now, how does it work? So it works by homeostasis and a general feeling of contentment. Now, this first picture on the left is the fear cascade. So it's a model of nervous system activation and then either recovery or not recovering. So, low level threat down here at 0, we should all be pretty homeostatic right now. This is, we're not under threat. Hopefully what I'm saying is interesting, and there's a general feeling of contentment about being here right now listening to this. Now, if someone loudly bangs on your bedroom door or your living room door, you're going to go to 1. What's that? That's weird. I'm a bit scared. I'm not too scared, but I'm a bit scared. And whilst you're thinking about that, I want you to also think about what it means to be homeostatic, because that's a really important question. And I ask people a lot, what does it mean to be homeostatic? And they sort of go, oh, I don't know the answer to that. I say that's doctors, psychiatrists. What does it mean to be homeostatic? And everyone sort of goes, oh, I don't know. And I say, so what do you think? And they say, well, not anxious. I'm like, right, anything else? Not in pain. So you get a long list of nots. I'm not anxious. Okay, so when you're not anxious, what does that mean? Oh, I don't have a tight feeling in my chest. I don't have a lump in my throat. My heart pounds aren't sweaty. So more nots. We live in a medical paradigm that's lots of nots. It's not that what's in place of not. So what does homeostatic mean? It means content, connected. It means able to love, able to receive, able to give, able to make love, able to come up with great ideas, able to be creative, able to sleep well, able to go for a run. All of the positive aspects of being human is what I believe homeostasis is all about. And why is it important? Well, it's evolutionarily essential for survival. Just as much as we need to have an autonomic nervous system to run away from a dinosaur or a lion that's chasing us, we also need to have an ability to be together, sit around a fire, make love with our partners, and hang out with our children and teach them how to be humans, because without that, we will also die as a species. So the having of homeostasis is just as important as an autonomic nervous system, and it's more important than not being sick. It's about being well. It's about being the most well we can get to. And I think it also begins to explain mystical experiences as well, because the kind of coordination that occurs within the system, the human body, and when the whole system's singing all the way up to the prefrontal cortex, that's when we go beyond dualistic consciousness, because at that point, inner and outer is matched and there's no difference. So we are completely at peace with ourselves and our surroundings. And that is a mystical experience, which can be explained by the ultimate form of human homeostasis, which probably is where psychedelics work, and I think on the endocannabinoid system. But if we go back to this graph, so loud bang on your door, and you're a bit like freaked out, and then one of your kids or your wife comes in and says, or your husband, and it's like, oh, it's only me, I'm just joking, and you're back at 0 again pretty quickly, right? But if it's 1 and there's a bang on the door and then a masked man comes in, you're at 2 instantly, right? And you're pumping adrenaline and you want to try and get out. Now you're trying to get away and you're running and you're running and you're running, you can't. and then a lion catches you. And that's when you go into overwhelm. And overwhelm is because of the secretion of mu and kappa opioids. They're dissociative. So they dissociate us from reality. Now, you hear a lot of people say that internal opioids, endorphins, give us a feeling of well-being, which is absolutely true. They give you a feeling of well-being when you're being eaten by a dinosaur. They're not responsible for a feeling of well-being when you're homeostatic. That is a different human physiology, and that is the endocannabinoid system. And this is a major problem with modern medicine because they think that the opioids are a good thing. They're not. Opioids are secreted when you're having your leg chewed off for a lion because you don't want to be there. It's a dissociative response. So people get to overwhelm and they go to 3. Now 3 means they might be able to get away, but they also might not. And then 4 is basically, you're about to cark it. So it's all over. So, 4, a dissociative response at 4 could account for an out-of-body experience, for instance. Now, there are different points here. Point 1, you could stay stuck there for your whole life, and many people do. Now, if you think that the human endocannabinoid system its major role is to bring us down this fear cascade back to 0, then if you have a hypoendocannabinoid state, not enough endocannabinoids, that's when you get stuck at 1. And that's produced by something called allostatic load. So homeostasis is being homeostatic. Allostasis is the active function of bringing us back to homeostasis. So to bring us from 2 to 1 to 0 is an allostatic process. The body actually has to expend energy to bring us back to homeostasis. And if you have somebody who's had multiple childhood adverse events, complex trauma, etc., or even trauma as an adult, then they go to 1 and 2, and that creates a load. It's an energetic load, and that's allostatic load. So to get back to 0, you have to shed the allostatic load, and that is why you need an external cannabinoid, say, in order to do that. And as that bottle said 100 years ago, a general feeling of contentment, because you take it, and when you get, it can be stoned, but it can be a lot better than stoned, actually. But it gets people back to 0. So really, what I'm getting at is people getting stuck at 1 or 3. Now, people who've spent their whole life with really, it's pretty rough, they dissociate a lot. And what was initially a protection mechanism that the brain had to employ or the mind had to employ to get them out of that situation, so it wasn't quite as painful. I think a lot of people think that dissociation is a protection, but I don't. I think the first time it happens is a break, and then the mind and the body learn that it can go to that break every single time, so they stay dissociated. Now, people who use a lot of heroin invariably have complex trauma, and they've invariably grown up in difficult environments that they've had to dissociate from all the time. And what's their choice of drug? It's a naturally occurring substance that our brains secrete when we're being eaten by lions and tigers to make us feel good. So it makes total sense why people use it. THC, because lots of people with trauma use THC, and I think it's a bit of both. I think it does produce that kind of underlying hedonic tone and makes people feel good, but I think it can also be used to dissociate from reality as well, which is where it's complex, because it's not all, beer and Skittles. THC, especially THC, is another drug of abuse, and we need to be careful with it. I have never had a patient come to me and say, "Hey doc, I can't stop taking LSD," or "I can't stop taking psilocybin." It's never happened, because they're not drugs of addiction. It's impossible. Whereas THC is. But I think if you think about it from a trauma-informed perspective, that people don't have enough naturally occurring cannabinoid, and maybe they've got used to dissociating, then it's the perfect mechanism, isn't it? Because it's replacing what they're missing, and they can get away from difficult feelings. So now this next image, it just kind of reiterates that in a physical form. that this is someone in pain, in back pain. And if any of you have had back pain, you know how painful it is, B, how easy it is to get trapped in it. So like a stimulus entrapment, you think about the pain gets worse, the pain causes you to think about it. So you just end up in a cycle. And then a lot of the time you go to hospital in extreme pain and they give you a drug that mimics the dissociation response that occurs naturally in your body. So that you're there in pain and then you just get dissociated from it for a while. Nothing really changes. Hence you get stuck in a cycle that just goes round and round and round and round. And on top of that, if you think about someone with back pain, the whole biomechanics go out. So the one thing they need to be able to do is stand up and walk properly. And the one thing they can't do is stand up and walk properly because all those muscles and everything's turned on. So the body has these defense mechanisms, whether that's emotional or physical, that actually, once they're activated, keep us stuck in suffering. So we have to learn how to break that. And you don't do that, in my personal experience, with a lot of the pharmaceutical drugs around. But it can be done with cannabinoids, and it can be done with a good dose of psilocybin, because it breaks the cycle and it returns a homeostasis. But it really, it's breaking the glass, like get out of that state. And then that's usually a fairly difficult process for people as well. It's not take this and everything goes great. It's take this and it's usually pretty tough for a few hours, because they're trying to break out of a defense system that doesn't want them breaking out of it, because it believes that that's where they should be. And it's a glitch in our physiology, basically. I think it's a glitch in nature's design of humans, and we haven't really understood it. And if we do understand it, then we also realize that nature gave us the solutions to her mistake, which are cannabinoids and psilocybin DMT. So, it's all there in front of us once you get it. It's hard to get it when you don't have access to the physiology, because these are inner healing physiologies. The endocannabinoid system is an inner healing physiology. Big dose of psilocybin, primary consciousness, non-ordinary state. It's an inner healing physiology. You go into a form of consciousness that allows you to process things that need to be processed. And much like if you break your leg and you have to have it pinned back together, you need an anesthetic on board to have that operation. And I think some of these emotional processes, you need an anesthetic on board. And that is what MDMA, psilocybin, and cannabinoids can do. They actually allow us to reprocess this horribly painful stuff whilst still awake, still in consciousness. So having said all of that, how does it work? Well, this is our primary endocannabinoid, and it's called anandamide. And that's why I called my clinic Ananda, because I was actually I was trying to get away from the cannabis plant and being another cannadoc, or can I have some more weed, please, doctor? And actually focus on what we're trying to do here, which is manipulate the human endocannabinoid system. So anandamide is our primary endocannabinoid, and whoever named it that was onto it. What does this do? Well, it balances all the internal systems. So if you think in the brain, you've got GABA and glutamate. Glutamate excitatory and GABA inhibitory. And the endocannabinoid system balances that excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission in the brain. So by an active control mechanism, brings around homeostasis. Now, when they start to balance and you get a more than usual coordination of mind-body processes, that's when we start to ascend through different layers of consciousness. And then we start getting into the higher layers, which are mystical experiences. So those experiences are due to a more than usual coordination in mind and body processes. Ananda is Sanskrit for internal bliss. So not only is this important for cannabis, I think in time it will actually be proved to be being reset as a kind of top down through the 5-HT2A receptor. And if you think about someone having a psychedelic process, it gets a bit haywire, but the more they resolve, the more homeostatic it becomes. So if that anandamide balances the neurotransmission and default mode and those different networks through that receptor, that more than usual coordination within default mode then leads to, ascending levels of consciousness, basically. But back on Earth, the ECS is a thermostat. So it kind of, it's an active process. So if you think about temperature, human bodies don't like going out of temperature range too much. So we get too hot, then processes are employed to cool us down, and vice versa. If we get too hot, we die. If we get too cold, we die. So there's an active process, and that is going on outside of our conscious awareness. Blood gases, all of these things are homeostatic. And feeling states, emotions, you know, when we're children, we seek out our caregivers as part of homeostasis. In that early proto-conversation between a mother and her baby, the mirroring and the reflection is beginning to set up a homeostasis in the infant. So humanity and nature is actually revolved around homeostasis. When you start to look at models of it, it's a Mandelbrot set. It's an unfolding fractal that just keeps, it's an active process. So consciousness can be modeled as a fractal as well. And when you start to see the patterns of homeostasis and the mathematical modeling, then it all starts to make a bit more sense. And I think feeling states as well. I think we have an emotional homeostasis where when we're taught that as children, we can regulate our emotions. It's not static, it's not parasympathetic, it's a constantly moving state. We all do it throughout our days. We're good, we're bad, we're a bit frustrated, we're not frustrated, we're tired. There's a constant process of rebalancing what's going on within us. That's active, and it's not explained by parasympathetic versus sympathetic. That's just too simple, really. So there's two receptors in the human body, CB1 and CB2. CB1 is the central nervous system, and CB2 is in the peripheral nervous system and the organs, etc. Now, this is interesting, there's been two receptors since the end of what was called the Precambrian era, and that ended 541 million years ago with the division of vertebrates and invertebrates. So when those two appeared on planet Earth, so did the CB1 and CB2 receptor. Now, if that's the basis for homeostasis within any organism on this planet, then 541 million years of it means that it is utterly essential for survival. So contentment, internal bliss are essential for human survival. Yeah, so there's two major endocannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG. I don't talk about 2-AG much because it gets bonkers complicated, the system. But how they really work, and the next slide's a bit better, I think. Yeah, so we talk about that thermostat and that balancing across that synapse. So along here you have an action potential. It hits the presynaptic terminal, a neurotransmitter is released, and then it hits a receptor on the postsynaptic terminal, and there's ongoing transmission of that action potential. So it's coming down and down and down. Now, the endocannabinoid system is a retrograde neurotransmitter. So if that action potential is really fast, then the postsynaptic membrane will release anandamide or TAG, and that will travel back over the synapse to the presynaptic terminal, and it will then slow down the transmission of that action potentials across that synapse. And then if that's happening in excitatory and inhibitory, you can start to see that, you know, these little molecules that are around every single synapse start to fire and start to balance this whole thing out, which is that active homeostasis, which is a Mandelbrot or a Fibonacci. And then that's the coordination. As that system starts to balance out, then we can ascend from our reptilian brains to our prefrontal cortex, basically. And then this one's got a little cannabis leaf, which is showing you that we're just taking something from a plant that is very structurally similar to endocannabinoids. And then that has an action at that receptor in place of the endocannabinoids, really. So nothing wrong with that. Don't know why they banned it. It doesn't make any sense. Plus, there are none of these receptors in the brainstem, heart, or lungs, so it's literally impossible to die of a cannabis overdose. And then when you understand that and you look at the other one major medicinal plant, the opium poppy, the street version's heroin. It's deadly, it's addictive, and it's been widely prescribed, as opposed to the one where the worst street form is bikey hydro, which no one wants anyway, but it's not deadly, is it? Makes no sense. Makes us all look really stupid. So this is makes the medical profession look a bit stupid, in my opinion. This is the same picture. So you've got a glutamate terminal, a whole bunch of intracellular stuff happening, and then the neurotransmitters released back over the synapse to have their action at the CB1 receptor. Now THC, which I'm going to get to right now, but I'm going to show you on this slide because it's a bit better. THC, basically, so anandamide is a full agonist of the CB1 receptor. So it has full activation activity. A molecule hits it, it sets off all these intracellular pathways, and you get an action. THC is a partial agonist at the same receptor. So THC works in place of anandamide. And then you talk to people about why they use THC, and they say, because it makes me happy and it makes me feel relaxed and I sleep better. Ah, right. So what does anandamide do in the human body? Basically what THC does in the human body, because we're tickling the same receptor. It's really just basic physiology. Yeah, I find it baffling that so many people are resistant to that simple fact that we have a molecule in us that sort of does a similar thing to THC. So are we going to ban being happy, ban hedonic tone? Like once the facts drop in, it's stupid. It really doesn't make sense. CBD is a bit different, right? You can see here that anandamide is being broken down by this enzyme called fatty acid amine hydrolase, so FAH. CBD blocks that enzyme. So CBD makes you feel better because it's boosting anandamide levels. That's what it does. So THC acts in place of anandamide at the receptor. CBD blocks the breakdown of it. So one is boosting and the other is acting in replacement. And then you can start to understand, from my perspective as a prescriber, if I can start getting the doses right, the different ratios, the terpenes, it's so much more magical and interesting than smoking a bong, which is why I find bongs even more offensive these days, because it's just like, it just doesn't make any sense when you start to understand what we can really do with these molecules. So yeah, lock and the key, that's basically an agonist, goes in the lock, produces an effect. So CB1 has a direct effect on, THC has a direct effect on CB1. And CBD has indirect effects on CB1 and CB2, and it does that by blocking the enzyme that breaks down anandamide, and that restores homeostasis by promoting sleep, appetite, stress reduction, and modulation of pain. Right. So if you have poor sleep, poor appetite, lots of stress, and lots of pain, then you're not homeostatic, which is really common sense. So it regulates pleasure, memory, cognition, sensory processing, and brain development. It's actually really fascinating how the endocannabinoid system is essential for embryo development. It's essential for birth. It's essential for babies latching onto the mother. And if you think about that proto-conversation and putting the homeostasis into that infant, that's endocannabinoid system. So, and I think that's another interesting point to make now, that endocannabinoid medicine is not just about cannabis plant, and that's one of the real it's a real shame about what's happening at the moment, because there's lots of people trying to make money out of it, lots of people trying to sell lots of weed legally, and that is what they are doing, and they know full well that it's not this medicine. They are just selling a lot of weed because they want to list on the stock market, and it's pretty revolting. So the medicine is not just about the plant, it's about exercise, it's about connection, it's about having relationships, about the conditions that create homeostasis within the human body. And when you understand, what really got my interest when in the training I'm doing in psychotherapy, one of the guys who wrote the kind of model, I think it was 92, he wrote this book, which was the same year the endocannabinoid system was discovered. And he was talking about this stuff, and he said, what is this as yet unidentified neurophysiological system that is responsible for hedonic tone? And he actually wrote that the year that they discovered the endocannabinoid system. So that hedonic tone, that feeling of contentment, which I believe has to come from that coordination of mind-body processes, which is the endocannabinoid system, basically. Yeah, so it was going to look a bit silly. The other interesting thing CBD does is it changes how THC interacts with that receptor. So I'm not a fan of unopposed THC, and I don't think that's nature's way. I think that everyone should be using CBD if they're having THC, because that's how the plant, that's basically the plant, and more than that, minor cannabinoids, flavonoids, terpenes, it's all in there. So unopposed THC is actually not very good and causes problems. But if you start adding CBD and other things in, it changes it. But so CBD is called an allosteric modulator, so it changes how the THC interacts with that receptor. So it limits the side effects, anxiety. It's an antipsychotic, and it limits the psychoactivity. And some people say, you know, that's bad. It doesn't limit the psychoactivity in a negative way. It limits it in that it limits it from, you know, causing psychosis, basically. So this next slide is about pain, which isn't, you know, it's not so relevant to this talk, although it probably is in some ways. But pain is, how we deal with pain is also homeostasis, right? So if you touch a boiling kettle, you pull your hand away, that's a homeostatic reaction. It's getting away from hot to cold. So we have how we grossly deal with pain. Someone's coming at you with a machete, you run away. If you cut your finger, you go into a response, which is to put pressure on it. So there's the active, and then there's what's going on at cellular level to stop the bleeding and cause the healing. That rhymed, that was good. So the management of pain, which is what I'm highlighting, is also about homeostasis. So the entire of existence is about homeostasis. And when you start to picture homeostasis as a fractal mathematical model, you know, it really starts to make sense why these fractals may appear to people in non-ordinary states. And, you know, the physiology we're manipulating, which is forcing sometimes people back into a fractal arrangement with themselves. And that's important because we're trying to mainstream this to help people. So we have to come up with these models. But this is a synapse. It's a pain. It's a pain neural pathway. And if you look here, I put this in because it's interesting. You've got opioids at the top, descending supraspinal modulation. That's how they work. And then they also work on inflammation and the presynaptic excitation. So you've got all these kind of funky ways of trying to deal with pain. And then you look here, and THC and the CB1 receptor modulating the transmission of pain across that synapse. You know, like, it doesn't make sense why you'd start using all this other stuff further up and around the corner when you can just target the presynaptic membrane. And then with that, you know, a lot of my patients who talk to them about pain, and they start using the cannabis, and they come back and their pain scores might not be vastly different. It might still be 6 or 7 out of 10. And that's where I think some of the evidence falls down, because they look at pain scores and then there's no statistical significant difference, so it's rejected. But then you say to people, okay, so your pain's, oh, but I'm so much better, doc. And it's like, okay, cool, tell me. Oh, well, I'm just really content and happy, and I'm able to hang out with my kids and my wife, and I can go for a walk, and I cook my dinner, and I'm sleeping. It's like, all right, so your pain, no, at the moment. But then you see them 4 months later and their pain's 4 out of 10. And then you see them 8 months later and their pain's 2 out of 10. Because to heal, we need to be homeostatic. And healing as an adult, when you're a bit older and you've got something that's gone wrong, takes a few months, because we don't heal like 4-year-olds, right? But we don't heal when we're not in homeostasis. So when we're on that autonomic nervous system, we don't heal. And that's what chronic pain is. It's the maintenance of that autonomic nervous system state, which does not allow the body to go into healing. So you give people cannabinoids and they go into healing physiology, But a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, the pain hasn't got much better because it's a slipped disc or it's a crushed vertebrae, and it takes months. So you use the cannabis to get them into that physiology, and then the body actually does the rest whilst they're feeling good along the way because they're sleeping and relaxing and hanging out with their kids and able to work. So it's working on this CB1 receptor, but it's also producing a general feeling of contentment. You know, I left hospital medicine because there are two things you need when you're sick: rest and nutrition. So how can I work in a system for the next 35 years that doesn't give people the two fundamental pillars of healing? I just knew it was going to annoy me, so I had to get out. This is about the reward circuits and chronic pain. So you've probably heard a lot about how not only cannabis is a painkiller, but it can really reduce opiate use. And it's also doing that through the dopamine. So it brings homeostasis to the mesolimbic reward circuit. So they're not getting this big hit of dopamine every time they satisfy themselves with an opiate. So there's less joy in using the opiate, basically. And then when you've got chronic pain turned into that, they're feeling content all the time. So they're not getting that dopamine hit every time they dose. So then they don't need it as much. And that's when they just naturally start dropping off opioids. It's not forced. It's natural because they're homeostatic and their body wants to heal. And previously it's that kind of overwhelm, dissociation, reward. You know, it's not very healthy. This next section is about anxiety. So CB1's expressed highly in internal brain structures, and the mechanisms on how endocannabinoids affect anxiety occur through CB1. So CBD is anxiolytic in humans, we know that. It reduces fear memory expression and produces an enduring reaction in learned fear expression in conjunction with therapy. Now, it has direct action at the 5-HT1A receptor, which is directly anxiolytic, and it boosts anandamide. And there's a few things I think we need to put together still, which will happen in the next few years. But when I look at people using CBD and then work as a therapist, and this kind of inner healing physiology, so I started reading about it a lot, and there was a really interesting study, and there's a CB1 receptor antagonist, so does the opposite of anandamide, called rimonabant or something. It was an epilepsy drug, but it got taken off the market post initial rollout because of all the side effects. But they found that people who were on that drug, the EMDR was ineffective, right? So it's an antagonist of CB1 receptors in the amygdala. Well, all of them, but in the amygdala, that's responsible through EMDR. We must think through reducing fear memory expression. So if you block that response, then it doesn't occur. So it blocked EMDR, which means EMDR is working through the CB1 receptor in the amygdala somehow. And if you think about EMDR, it's left-right balancing. So it's producing a homeostasis within the brain that then allows people to revisit traumatic memory or reprocess it. So I do think that the endocannabinoid system is going to be really important for all of the new therapies and treatment of trauma as we move forward. And I think a lot of people, and I had it when I started prescribing too, I just thought about cannabis. It's like it comes with the stigma. It's like endocannabinoid system, cannabis. But which is what I was referring to earlier, it's not just cannabis, it's all the things that make us homeostatic and psychedelics. And psychotherapy. You know, psychotherapy is a co-created homeostasis. You're trying to create an environment for that person that maybe they didn't have as a child, so they don't know how to activate the physiology of just sharing their thoughts and their unconscious and what's going on for them, and not being judged or rejected or gaslit or turned it back on them, or all the stuff that produces that loss of fit, which is trauma. So loss of fit, in my mind, that's when the loss of homeostasis occurs. And like I've referenced a couple of times, that proto-conversation, the baby does something, the mother mirrors it, gives it back with a bit more. And there's a a relationship, and that relationship is a fractal. Z equals Z squared, Z amplified plus a constant from mother, C, equals Z, which is the very basis of fractal geometry, really. So that homeostasis, the underlying sort of self develops, and that hedonic tone, and that's when that baby starts to put together its sense of self in that homeostatic place. So therapy is as much about the endocannabinoid system as CBD itself, basically. This is just a slide that shows you where it's working. So it blocks FAAH. It has direct action at 5-HT1A and all these transient phenyloid receptors. So it does lots of different things to balance the physiology in the body. And then this is chronic stress, which is really where we started. But ECS dysfunction and chronic stress gives us a maladaptive HPA axis, so hyperactivity and then potentially depression as a result of that. So yeah, that's why also it takes time, because if you've got, you know, an overactive HPA axis, that takes many months to settle down. It's not a week of CBD, it's a year or two of therapy and CBD. And I think that's another really important part of healing that we've really missed as a society, that this stuff takes time. Back pain, complex trauma, it takes years, and it can't be done quickly, really. Psychedelics can help, cannabis can help. In fact, they might be the only things that engage the physiology required to begin the healing process. But that healing process is not 10 sessions with a psychologist. You know, for this difficult stuff, it's not a Big Mac and fries. It's a prolonged, maybe even a lifetime of commitment to self-growth, because being human's hard. Yeah, so that's the last slide. Balance, regulation, and homeostasis. Yeah, so I hope everyone has learned something new about homeostasis and how important it is for humans. Yeah, I've finished. We do questions now.
That was incredible. Thank you so much to learn. What a absolute universe we have inside us, and to discover, you know, the endocannabinoid system. You say 92?
92. Yeah, they were trying to work out, they weren't even trying to find out about the endocannabinoid system, they were trying to find out how THC had its effect. And they found a receptor, and the guy was like, oh, there's a receptor, right, well, what stimulates that? And then he found anandamide.
Absolutely incredible. So yeah, let's open up this space to the group. Any questions you can put in the chat, or just put your hand up. And, you know, Jamie's also pretty skilled in talking about other psychedelics with these medicines as well. So feel free to, you know, ask anything, and we will try to address it. Okay, Mason.
Hi. So I just got a quick question. Just in regards, I'm not sure if there's been any studies, but I was just wondering if you'd have any information on CBD's effects on memory as opposed to THC's effect on memory. I've read like quite a bit of stuff saying THC is sort of cuts your short-term memory. Just wondering if CBD also has that effect.
Not that I know of. The stuff I was talking about earlier wasn't necessarily CBD or THC. It was the role of the endocannabinoid system in memory, and especially in sort of traumatic memory. Yeah, so I think that's, you know, that section of it's important if you think about homeostasis. So there's sort of models of memory, explicit, implicit. There's like a hierarchy, and when we're mystical, say, we're much more of the memory systems are online, but when we're traumatized or in a traumatic moment, we're storing memory in systems that aren't accessible to consciousness. They're implicit, which is why we lose the memory. So yeah, I think, do you know what I think? There isn't much data around THC, and that's the biggest problem with it. There just haven't been enough studies done, if any at all, that really look at memory. We know it affects short-term memory. Does it do that long-term? Don't know. CBD, excuse me, I find that CBD doesn't affect people's memory, and it actually helps them access memory and reprocess memory. So, you know, I think a lot of it, THC can do that too, especially traumatic memory, because it creates, you know, a homeostasis in the system, which then might allow it to be reprocessed, which is going through the endocannabinoid system. But we have a long way to go, really. And I think an analogy I use a lot is a drug like propofol that the anaesthetists use, you know, and it's fairly heavy stuff, and it can cause, you know, it can kill people. But when used with skill, with knowledge of physiology and pharmacology, it's an amazing thing. And I think that's what a lot of people are missing about this stuff, that there's nothing, don't get me wrong, I've got no problems with people recreationally using cannabis. I think that we should change the laws, but that has got nothing to do with the medicine or using it to reprocess trauma and traumatic memory. It's got nothing to do with it. So, and the skill involved and the timing, and when do we give the CBD? Do you have a big dose before a therapy session with a THC dose in the therapy session, or after, or 2 hours before? We just don't know any of that stuff yet. And it's going to take a while, because none of us can get 350 mil together to do the studies, basically. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah. No, that's sort of I think that's about answered my question. Thank you.
Good.
I'll just add there, I guess it's all subjective, obviously no data on this, but just from the work that I've been doing, I've noticed, obviously, if people overuse cannabis, it can impact their processing speed and their functionality. But what I've noticed, when people get that sweet spot, that balance between the oils, a lot of them report cognitive improvement, as well as if they're doing medicinal mushrooms like reishi and lion's mane as well. It's
a really good point, Alana, because it's that sweet spot, and that's what the medicine's about. Like I said, if people want to do whatever on their spare time, that's different. But engaging this healing physiology and finding that sweet spot where cognition's improves and memory's improves, and the capacity to feel without dissociating or without going into sort of shutdown processes, that's the important point. And that's why I think it's being overlooked, and we're looking at MDMA and psilocybin as, you know, that's really shiny and that's what everyone wants to do. But I think if you can create the right physiology in the human body with endocannabinoids, it's going to be just as effective in therapy, if not more so, because you can do it twice a week for a year, you know, and you can use the other ones as well. So it should be together. And I think when I started this journey, I thought a lot more that it would help people get off SSRIs and, you know, into psychedelic therapy. But more and more now, I actually see, once we start getting it right, these especially trauma patients, they just really start making headway fast. It's really interesting.
We'll go Violet, then Dan.
Thanks, Jamie. That was a really great presentation. I have a question from my housemate, who's unfortunately wasn't able to make it today, but knew that you would be with us and really wanted me to ask, is it possible that too much stimulation of the endocannabinoid system could lead to things like fibromyalgia? Or conversely, what is the effect of CBD and or THC on fibromyalgia?
That's a good question. Can I start with the second part? So there are a number of conditions, fibro being one of them, migraines, maybe endometriosis as well, that a lot of us are starting to believe are due to an endocannabinoid deficiency. So that's why they're not treated very well in the modern paradigm, because the very thing that's needed to treat them was banned. So to take that further, why? Well, are they because of a stress response that the body can't resolve? And, you know, I conceptualize fibro more and more now as being a result of unprocessed emotion. you know, so it's a stress state, but rather than the emotions being recognized, the body has to resort to pain. So it's kind of a somatic conversion disorder, but that's a really crap description because it's not somatization, it's real pain, but it's pain caused by emotion. And if that's unprocessed emotion, one could argue that it's trauma. So therefore, they have a hypoendocannabinoid state because of the activation on that fear cascade. And then something's gone a bit haywire. So the emotion's not felt, but it's felt as pain. And once you get it right with the fibro patients, a lot of them do get better. But yes, you can overstimulate it, as you can with any condition. And that's why, you know, I think the war on drugs is really a bad, you know, I've got nothing good to say about it. But the more I do this, the more I actually think the culture that has in times come up in opposition for it is just as damaging. Because there's a lot of people who believe that THC is there to blow their brains out and they want to smoke 2 grams a day in a bong and that should be allowed. It's bollocks. That's really bad for people, you know. So that's why the ECS is about balance, and that's why I talk about mystical and coordination, because when you get it right, you know, people turn on, like their cognition, their ability to process emotion and connect. And then if you go too far, they're asleep on the sofa, or they're paranoid, or they're getting angry the next day. And that happens a lot too, that you drop people too far into it initially. So this anger comes out. They've been anxious for years, and underneath it is loads of anger to be processed. And the CBD just rips it off, and the THC helps. So, you know, this is what we're starting to learn, that you have to go in sometimes really slowly. And, you know, I don't feel anything, yes, because we don't want you to for 2 months, because your system's not ready to start processing this stuff yet. And that I think is going to happen more and more. So yeah, totally, fibro, cannabinoids for fibro, endo, migraines. But yes, you can have too much, and it, you know, and also if you think about that dissociative response, you know, a lot of people use alcohol, sex, chocolate, whatever it is, they use that to escape reality still. So THC is doing the same. Big bong, you know, you're on planet wherever, and I don't mean in a good way. So it's very nuanced, and I think we've got a lot to learn, like we do psychedelic therapy. We just have, you know, psilocybin, we just have so much to learn about why and when and who and how, and, you know, yeah, which needs more of us. That's the thing. You can't do it when it's banned, but if you've got lots of good people working with this stuff in the right way, then we start to get real progress, because there'd be 1,000 minds instead of 10. Help?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Right.
And Dan?
Hey, Jamie, how you going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good to see you. That was fascinating. Look, a couple of things. So, in terms of like as a medicine compared to a pharmaceutical, you know, I use medicinal cannabis and pharmaceutical drugs, and I feel much more that I have a sort of a relationship with cannabis. There's a, you know, it feels much more deeply connected. Yeah. So that, you know, I noticed that as a so that was more of a statement than anything. But my real question was, what Rick Simpson oil? That's the only way I know to describe it. I'm sure that I don't know whether that's part of. So there's flour and there's oil, but yeah, whether or not the as a prescriber that's used, you know, because there's obviously, you know, I've read about with cancer, with Parkinson's, with lots of different really difficult disease states that,
sure,
that there's some use for that. I was just really curious about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with the Rick Simpson oil. It's basically a ratio, and I think it's from a plant or a breed that had a certain ratio of CBD to THC, and it was a lot more CBD. But this is then where I fall out with it, because there's a lot of people who say, oh, breast cancer is a 3-to-1 ratio, epilepsy is a 5-to-1 ratio, X is a 2-to-1 ratio. And it's not true, because it's completely individual. So if you think about what Alana said and what I'm saying about turning this system on, it's different for everybody, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying with the relationship, because it requires a relationship and it requires personal insight. So, you know, if I'm anxious and I know I'm anxious and I have THC, it makes it worse. So part of my relationship now is knowing when I can have some and when I can't.
Yeah.
Even though I might want some, sometimes I know that it's actually the worst thing for me. Sometimes I don't need any, so I don't have any. Sometimes I'm really stressed and CBD is all I need. So I have a relationship with the medicine because I understand myself more deeply and I understand how that affects me more deeply. And then I can tinker with different ratios, and that's then the deepening. So different flowers with different terpene profiles, different strengths, they do different things. I mean, it's a shit analogy because wine is not a medicine, but it's a bit like having a Stella and a Guinness and a Barossa Shiraz and a Marlborough Sauvignon and a single malt. You know, you have a different one at a different time depending on how you're feeling, and cannabis is exactly the same. So implicit in that understanding is knowing how I am feeling. So I have to have that relationship with myself in order to use the plant correctly, which is exactly what you're pointing out, I think.
Yeah.
You know, it requires, it's a two-way street. It's not 20 milligrams of fluoxetine every morning and a half an hour prazolam at night, which has there's no relationship there. It's just take the drug and that's it. And that's why it doesn't work, because we're not static. Even when we're good, we're not static beings. And that's the Mandelbrot, the fractal. It's a constantly changing system that we all are with ourselves and with each other. So I think Rick Simpson's great, and we don't have it in Australia really, and I'm sure it has lots of uses, but I fall out with it when that people say, oh, you've got prostate cancer, you need a 5-to-1. And it's like, no, you don't. You need a balanced endocannabinoid system so you can heal. And that could be a 2-to-1 tomorrow and a 6-to-1 on Thursday. You know.
Have I got? Can I ask another question?
Sure, of course you can.
Only because we like you, Dan.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I'm curious. So I reckon I started using cannabis. You know, I'd used it in my 20s, and then probably about maybe 4 years ago. So, and that was just like sort of recreational. I had no relationship with it and so on. But and then obviously I see you, and you know, it's developed over time. But it's taken me time to develop that relationship and to you know, often if someone talks about cannabis, they might say, "Oh, it makes me feel really, you know, paranoid or unpleasant or whatever." And I've been through all those experiences, but over time, I've got to a point that it's, you know, it feels like part of me. You know, the system working, or working with the plant. If you've got somebody who's in, say, need of high THC to treat pain or, you know, whatever it might be, and you know, maybe they don't, you know, that it's going to make a massive difference for them, but how do you explain trying to develop that relationship for someone if it's sort of important that they do it in a hurry, if you know what I mean, if that makes sense? Like if it's kind of urgent that,
well, you can't, well, it's like any relationship, it can be great on the first night, but it gets better with time, you know? So someone like that, I go in pretty, you know, I'll go in with a good dose and I'll say, watch out, this stuff can be tricky. And, you know, to your comment, you know, sometimes you get anxious or you get paranoid, and people say it to me all the time, oh, I don't like THC, it makes me paranoid. And I say, does it? And they say, yeah. Whenever I had it, it makes me paranoid. I'm like, so it makes you paranoid, or it shows you that you're paranoid? You know, because that's the important bit. I don't think it does make people paranoid. I think it shows them it's a non-specific amplifier. You know, so they're just completely unaware of how anxious and paranoid they actually are a lot of the time. You know, and then, as you say, you get used to that. So really, our discomfort, difficult feelings can be amplified, and we get better at sitting with them, which is building a relationship, and I think is as important as good feelings too. And then, a lot of people as well, they'll say, oh yeah, I had, so I often compare illegal cannabis, it's not all of it, but I often compare it to kind of hooch. It's moonshine. It was made in the basement. So people come into my office a lot and they think that they kind of have a good idea of what I'm going to prescribe, and I'm like, no, you've been smoking hooch your whole life, and this is a Scottish Highlands single malt, and you cannot make a single malt out the back of Nimbin. You just can't do it. Sorry, Nimbin, but you can't. It has to be in the Scottish Highlands, So then, not only that, they had a bong or whatever when they were however age, and it really affected them badly. And then the analogy is, well, you downed a litre of moonshine the first time you drank. You know what I mean? Which is what they did. And then you would never drink again. If you down a litre of moonshine the first time you drink, you ain't touching that again, ever. So it's all what you're saying. It has different effects at different times, but none of it is any more than what's going on within us and common sense, So people who haven't had THC for a while, like the ones in pain, I just give them a little bit. And then I warn them, it might be a bit rough. And there might be a whole bunch of stuff that you're holding on to that's blocking you from getting better. And when you take that, it's going to want to show you what's blocking you from getting better and ask you to take responsibility for it. And then they often come back and say, it was terrible, but I felt so much better. Because it's just how we frame it. And at the moment, it's, oh, that THC made you paranoid, run away from it. Here, take this and numb the pain, and don't talk to a therapist and stay stuck in it forever. Whereas all these new medicines are like, embrace the discomfort, learn to sit with it, So it's a totally different paradigm. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks heaps.
No worries.
I'd ask another one. No,
you've got time. We've got to have another one.
I might add something.
No.
Sorry, my internet keeps dropping in and out, so apologies, everyone, if you can't hear me. I just wanted to add there, based on Dan Brown's work, a lot of the programs me and Melissa are doing, particularly PrEP and integration, is helping people to develop metacognitive skills in the sense of a really deep, nuanced relationship with their mind, their body, their spirit, the social world, the larger mind, and with that, a lot of skills on tracking and monitoring, discernment.
We lost you again. We lost Alana. Do you want to do your last question, Dan?
Oh, no. Look, I wasn't so much a question. It was more just to say, another experience thing that overwhelmingly my experience in the past with cannabis was that it was an unpleasant feeling. So I didn't really use it. And then I had those unpleasant experiences, and over time, my relationship has changed with that experience, and it's ended up becoming a very soothing, calming, kind, almost another sense of self that comes in to soothe. That's just my experience anyway.
Well, that you said it all there. Another sense of self that comes in to soothe. Now that's exactly what I'm talking about with that baby in the proto conversation. It's another self that helps soothe that baby. And so that's beginning in our early life. And then you think about plant spirits, which Alana mentioned, one's called the mother. And it's like, well, what is that sense that allows us to face our unconscious and become homeostatic? And we call her the mother. A soothing sense of self that allows me to reprocess my own stuff. A therapist, a plant medicine, a mother for a baby. This is what I'm saying. This is homeostasis, and it's dependent upon relationship. We learn it in relationship, and we maintain it in relationship. And that, I think, is what all these medicines are trying to teach us, that we're communal spirits and we have to be homeostatic and around the fire to survive. And anything that's stopping us from sitting around the fire in a pleasant experience is psychopathology. If you're anxious or depressed, or you can't sit there and do that, then you're unwell. So it's the returning to that very basic sense of feeling ourselves around other sense of selves, you know. It's really interesting.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks so much.
No worries. So Lana's just written, track cognitive skills, our ability to track, monitor, watch, discern, reflection, be curious, hold multiple perspectives, and have nuanced relationships with our mind, body, spirit, social world, which is exactly what we just said, right? It's this homeostasis. So interesting. And Mason made a comment. You asked about will we go wild? Not in Australia, no. It's actually happening in the medical space, and it's causing problems. And I think that's going to limit the recreational use. But my bet for Australia is that the next phase will be that it's very easy for GPs to prescribe it. So very straightforward. That will happen next. Then THC will get down scheduled from an 8 to a 4. So no longer morphine, but antibiotics or Valium. And then I think when that happens, we'll enter a long period of basically getting your scripts from the doctor, and doctors being pretty liberal about it within reason. But I just can't see Australia doing what happened in the US and Canada. It's not how things are done here. And do medical professionals have a voice? Not really. No. And there's some bad behavior going on, you know. There's a lot of people, you know, I've got patients who want to come to my clinic, and they ask my receptionist if I'll prescribe 90 or 120 grams a month, you know, because this is what they're getting from other doctors. That's 3 or 4 ounces of medical grade weed a month. You know, it's like, obviously not. Do you know what I mean? If you need that much, you're either selling it or there's a problem, because, you know, that's like smoking 2 or 3 grams a day at least. You'd be wheeling you around with a drip in your eye. Can't do anything. So will we be smarter? Yes, we will, but it just takes time. Yeah.
Right. Who else we got? Priscilla.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for sharing. My question is, I'm just wondering if there is, you know, like any major difference in terms of benefits for using CBD to using any of the psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin.
Good question. Yeah, I mean, they're totally different. I mean, that, you know, they're a different class of drug, I suppose. So psilocybin, LSD, DMT are classical serotonergic hallucinogens, which I think have their effect also through the endocannabinoid system, but it's a different receptor. I actually think we can probably do more with cannabinoids than psychedelics, just because of, especially CBD. It's like water, right? It's so safe, you know, and it's so harmless, and you know, it could. I kind of think that everyone should be on CBD. I say this a lot: oxygen, water, CBD. You know, it's been shown to stop people laying down traumatic memory. So soldiers and police officers and paramedics should be on CBD prophylactically, because it stops us laying down, because we don't get so traumatized. Everyone should be on it if they're in therapy. People who turn up to ED psychotic should be given a big dose of CBD before anything else. So I think its general utility in everyday life is much greater than psychedelics, because that's always going to need set and setting, you know, whereas cannabinoids not so much. If you know, you get home at night and you want to have some THC and it helps you de-stress and sleep better, and you're using it consciously, the access, everyone can do that. You can't go home and take some LSD medicinally and go to bed. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just a whole different process. So I think you're comparing apples with pears, but I think they all have a very important role in the future of humans, really. And I really do think in a few years' time, I mean, it's already happening. I see it already. Doctors who were really quite unpleasant when I started doing this are now prescribing it, you know, and some of them were really, really rude, really, like, you know, in the grand scheme of things, you've lost your right to ever prescribe that medicine through being such a wanker, you know, but they're doing it. So this change is upon us, and it's going to happen quite quickly. But I think cannabinoids have a really important role for much greater proportion of society in many ways, because it's easier to access, it's probably easier to get therapeutic benefit, and it's easier generally. Yeah, but I think as well THC could be used as a sort of psychedelic therapy type of paradigm too. People are already doing it, and that's far more accessible, because you'd have a dose of inhaled THC and 3 hours later you'd leave, you know, and that's not possible with LSD or psilocybin, unless big pharma gets hold of it, which is the next big danger, because they'll come up with 2-hour drugs that they patent, which will then prevent us from even more from decriminalizing psilocybin and MDMA and LSD, because they'll be financially invested in us not having access to non-patentable compounds. Does that help? Great.
Before we get back to Dan's final question, I just wanted to, I guess, make some comments, and then Jamie, you might be able to expand just on the potential for CBD and THC for women who are going through their cycle through PMDD, so premenstrual psychosis, or just PMS. If you got, I mean, anecdotally with the clients that I work with, it can be really supportive. So can psilocybin, microdosing psilocybin. Someone's written perimenopause as well. Do you have any comments on more from the female lens there?
Totally. I mean, I sort of saw it having more of an effect on this stuff as a consequence of it being given for anxiety or pain. But I think it just boils down to homeostasis and stress response. So for some women, these changes press an enormous amount of stress on the body, whether that's once a month or at perimenopause, and that stress can then lead to psychopathology, basically, because that's what psychopathology is in my mind. It's loss of fit to our environment. So we're stressed when we don't need to be, or we're anxious when we don't need to be. So there's a massive role if you start to conceptualize these things as stress disorders or stress on the body. And when you think like that, that's what I'm getting at. I'm being cheeky, but it's kind of like everyone should be on it, really. They should, as a first line, it should be, well, let's just make you happy first. Are you feeling happier? Yeah. How are your problems? Oh, it's all right. I'm happy. I'm not worried about it anymore. You know, it's just fundamental. It's like nutrition and sleep. Feeling content should be in there.
Yeah, thanks for the comment on the first responders. I've got a lot of friends in the military and family in the police, and now that CBD is much more accessible and legal, I think there needs to be some education, because there's a lot of them that just don't have a clue about it at all.
Don't have a clue, but it's through that action. It's because it's a CB1 receptor agonist, and a healthy CB1 receptor in the amygdala prevents the laying down of traumatic memory. Anyone being exposed to traumatic scenes should be given CBD physiologically to boost the endocannabinoid system to prevent traumatic memory being laid down.
There's probably capacity there, for people engaged in therapy that are in crisis for family violence, the potential there for that to be a treatment while they're trying to plan their safety and their therapy, because it's very hard to do that when you're dissociated and frozen. But if there was
totally
support.
That's the bottom line, right? We're inducing a physiological state of safety. That's kind of what I'm getting at. That's what we can just give people a medicine that brings them back to safety and contentment, and not just anxious, like feeling okay, feeling safe, feeling like the world, there might actually be some hope. Yeah.
We might go Violet and then Dan and then wrap it up.
Just super quickly, just what you guys were just saying just now just got me thinking about vicarious trauma and secondary trauma with, you know, social workers, psychologists, you know, psychiatrists and the like, are there any studies on CBD for that kind of group? Or what are your thoughts about it just in general, Jamie, in terms of, in the treatment of vicarious trauma for, you know, health professionals and allied health professionals and the like?
Well, it would be the same, wouldn't it? The same theory that we can prevent it. But then also, if you think about therapy, especially, I kind of believe that for a therapist to be effective, they have to be fairly homeostatic, because it's a co-created homeostasis. So you can't create homeostasis out of nothing. So one person in the room has to be able to do that. Yeah. And then if you think about people like Panksepp and his effective neuroscience, and he's written whole books about what are these inner healing physiologies, you know. So he talks about using oxytocin to heal trauma, and it's like, yeah, we know, but there are other medicines that do that and more, you know. And one of the things he talks about a lot is this kind of deep sort of emotional resonance with people. So being able to actually, you know, have true empathy for where they're at and fit with their current emotional state. And that requires homeostasis on the part of the therapist. So I think the same argument, like, I honestly mean it, CBD, basically everyone should be given a go, and everyone should have it in the cupboard, because it's that potent for human beings. It occurs in a plant. And I think that's kind of the problem. It's a bit like climate change. You know, we know the planet's up shit creek, but our government doesn't seem to want to accept it and make the changes necessary to reduce carbon emissions, which is counterintuitive. It's like, guys, look at the state of it. Can you just pull your fingers out and get on page and change it? But they won't do it. And CBD is the same. It's so obviously good for so many people. So why on earth are we still in this situation where it should be on the shelf next to cod liver oil? That's where it should be. THC, not so. THC is more tricky, but CBD should be on the shelf next to cod liver oil in an appropriate formulation that means it's safe and effective for us to use. And I reckon everyone would start using 50 or 100 milligrams a day. The world would change in front of our eyes, like if we stopped burning fossil fuels. But we're not allowed to, you know, they don't do it.
Hence, are we?
Exactly.
Thanks, Violet. Just as it's a little bit off topic, but I just wanted to highlight there, you know, obviously we're working towards homeostasis, and that's the goal. That's the goal in therapy. That's, you know, therapist needs to have that secure base, relational base to support that. But I guess the beauty about psychedelics, particularly the higher doses of the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, is people can go outside their window of tolerance, but be held in that safety, and then obviously get huge cathartic releases, somatic releases. But I find the more that I work with medicines, and, you know, a lot of my clients, is that when you're thrown out of homeostasis, you also have a larger repertoire of trust and bandwidth for dysregulation, because you've got the skills, you're working on the skills, you're committed to that relationship with self and the plants and your world, you know, philosophy, cosmology. So I think homeostasis is extremely important, but we live in a very chaotic world, and you also need to learn how to master some of these other states.
Yeah.
From a place of, you know, still have that self as you do that. So
it's interesting
talk about, you know, IFS in that and all sorts of, you know, altered state stuff that we don't have time for. But go for it, Jamie.
Well, I was just going to say, on that, you know, I was talking about Panksepp and oxytocin. He was talking about it because he believes that it can create a secure attachment in therapy. So he wasn't talking about the non-ordinary state. He was talking about creating secure attachment. And that really got me thinking about MDMA and how that is actually quite an important function of, apart from reprocessing, like feeling safe enough to express the stuff that you've never felt safe enough to express before, which then builds that therapeutic relationship long past the dosing session, because you can find a secure attachment. And I think that's something that's not being discussed enough about psychedelics and cannabis, homeostasis, connection, using them to build a really solid relationship, have a really difficult experience and have someone support you through it is as important as what might happen in that experience, you know?
And that's the gap in the clinical space, is because eventually, you know, the sessions end because it's an expensive clinical trial. And this is where we look to the anthropological data and the community alters in medicine, where the relationships don't stop. They continue. I think we just need to make sure we have a balanced view about the clinical data, and then also what people have been doing for eons, and what many alters are doing, you know, brilliantly around Australia and around the world with sustaining that long-term secure attachment.
Yeah.
Community.
Yeah. Bang on.
Last question, Dan, and then I'll give my gratitude to Jamie.
I just had a quick one about so CBD oil, just in terms of absorption and most efficient way of taking it. So whether you should leave it in your mouth or whether you swallow it, whether it just makes any difference. And then if there was a little on from that, was maybe that if you similarly ingesting cannabis in different ways, you can have a different response. So say with a bong, you'd have a different response to a joint to say using a vaporizer or eating it, or, you know,
yeah.
So just a bit around absorption and effects. And so, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So I don't think it makes a lot of difference between whether you swallow it straight away or hold it in your mouth. I think it's the dose, especially CBD. And I think that a lot of people underdose. You know, I think we actually need to be using, I start people on much bigger doses now. And then I tell them to go up fairly rapidly until they feel the effect. THC, not so, it's tricky. I think THC is absorbed much better with food. So if you have it in a gummy, or you have it in a cake, or you have it when you eat, it goes across the gut much quicker. But that's not so relevant for CBD. CBD seems to be absorbed whether you eat or not. And then, yeah, the last bit, it's so different because if you think about it's basically a dose in the brain. So a bong, you get a lot more THC in the brain a lot quicker than a joint, even because you're smoking it over a period of time. So the amount of THC hitting the receptor is much greater from a bong or a bucket than it is for a joint or from a vape. And then not only that, Dan, when you burn cannabis, you destroy all the minors, all the terpenes. So if you have a spliff of one type and then vape it, you'll get a completely different effect because you get all the terpenes and the minors. So it's how it's consumed and the doses. So I think CBD just has to have a really good dose, and doesn't matter. THC should have some food, generally sugary or fatty. And then, you know, I'm not sure, I never thought I'd say it, but I'm not sure I'll ever smoke a joint ever again because I think when it's crap, you don't have all that stuff in there, so you don't notice a difference. But when people have the medical grade, it's literally, it's like adding Coke to your single malt. It's like, what are you doing? You know, chucking some ice in a penfold. So you're like, why would you do that?
There's no doubt that's been the since I started seeing you and I've moved away from into the medicinal cannabis and oil, the night and day, it's you know, it's so obvious the difference, and
totally different.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much for tonight. It was really amazing.
Pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Legend. Thanks, Jamie. Cheers.
Yes, and thank you. Thanks for all the work we've done over the years and we'll continue to.
Will do.
You know, it's just want to, just say thank you to Jamie for being one of the few people out there that really gets it on many levels, medically, spiritually, pharmacologically, socially, you know, all those levels and realms. So I just want to say huge gracias. And his details are on my website, and also obviously at his website at Ananda Clinic. And feel free to reach out to us if you've got any questions. And yeah, we'll see you at the next webinar or next event, everyone.